They expected a coronation before they expected an ending, which was how I knew the fairy tale still hadn't learned its lesson. Because after everything that had collapsed, the mirror's authority, the queen's certainty, the carefully managed punishments that taught everyone how fear works, the court didn't ask whether I would rule. They assumed it, as if dismantling a system automatically qualified you for senior management, as if surviving structural violence came with a complimentary crown, and I let that assumption sit in the room longer than was polite. Because silence is where power reveals its habits, and the habit here was inheritance. The comforting belief that every rebellion is only acceptable if it ends with a new hierarchy that looks familiar enough not to scare anyone. And while they waited for me to step forward, some of them still glancing toward the forest as if 7 small men with pickaxes and a strong work ethic might jog out at the last minute to provide emotional support. I finally understood why the dwarfs had never appeared. Because the dwarfs exist to preserve innocence through retreat, to reward withdrawal with shelter, to sing while avoiding the problem. And I had never retreated. Not from the palace. Not from the mirror, not from the cost, so there was no honest role left for them here except as a footnote. Something I might visit later out of courtesy just to say hello and explain that structural inequality is not, in fact, fixable by communal living and good vibes. And by then, everyone had noticed that the mirror was still there, untouched and unstolen. Mounted in its frame like an artifact everyone pretended still mattered, and some whispered that I had failed. Because in the version they grew up with, victory is loud and involves property damage, preferably magical, and triumph is measured by the objects you remove from the world. But that logic only works if power lives in objects, and even the queen understood by now that it doesn't. Which was why she hadn't guarded the mirror or hidden it, because ownership becomes meaningless once belief evaporates. And the mirror still spoke, technically, but no one asked it anything anymore. Because after the public punishments and the quiet erasures, the court had learned the cost of answers, learned that rankings invite consequences and clarity manufactures victims, and so uncertainty became safer than truth. Which is a terrible foundation for a kingdom but a very effective way to shut people up, and that was when the mirror truly lost its power. Not when it was taken, but when its question stopped functioning, and the queen sensed it before she admitted it, standing before the glass one final time, not in rage or desperation, but in disbelief. Because disbelief is what happens when authority realizes it has outlived its purpose. And she asked who was the fairest out of habit rather than conviction. Like someone refreshing a page they know won't load. And when the mirror hesitated, answering softly and without certainty, it became obvious that nothing about it had changed. Except the audience, and I didn't interrupt or step forward or steal anything. Because stealing implies transfer and there was nothing left to take. I had planned to steal the mirror once. Turns out, taking it would have been the weaker move. The mirror had already been dismantled the only way that actually works, through refusal. Through non-participation, through exposing that its authority had always depended on consent disguised as destiny. And when the queen finally turned to me, it wasn't with accusation, but with recognition, saying that I had planned this, and I told her the truth, that I hadn't planned it, I had only recognized it. Because planning is control, but recognition is survival. And what I recognized from the beginning was that the mirror wasn't evil, it was infrastructure. A system that only functioned because everyone kept feeding it data and agreeing that comparison was necessary, and once that agreement broke, the system collapsed on its own, which was deeply inconvenient for everyone who enjoyed knowing exactly where they ranked. And that was when the room shifted again, not with fear this time but with anticipation. Because without the queen's certainty and without the mirror's authority, there was only one ending left they could imagine. And they looked at me like a solution, like a replacement, like the next reasonable ruler. And that was the final trap of the fairy tale. The assumption that a woman who breaks a system must secretly want to sit on top of it. And before anyone could kneel or pledge allegiance or ask what my tax policy would be, I said it clearly and calmly that I didn't become queen. And the silence that followed was heavier than any punishment. Because they were waiting for ambition dressed as humility and there was none. Because I hadn't dismantled the mirror to replace it and I hadn't survived to inherit a crown. And the mistake they kept making was believing that power must always be transferred instead of removed. And my refusal unsettled them more than rebellion ever could, because it denied them closure, denied them the comfort of a familiar hierarchy, denied them the ability to outsource responsibility to a single woman with better posture. And some of them were angry then, quietly, because my refusal left them without direction, while others looked relieved in a way they didn't yet have language for. Because for the first time they weren't being ranked, weren't being measured, weren't being told where they belonged. And women especially began to notice the space that opened when no one was evaluating them anymore. When beauty stopped being currency and obedience stopped being protection. And I left them one rule, written nowhere and enforced by no one, because rules that matter don't need guards, no mirrors, and no rankings. No systems that turn comparison into destiny, and the simplicity of it frightened them because it offered no throne. No villain, no clean ending, and there was no coronation or triumph or ceremonial transfer of authority, because stories like this aren't fixed, they're abandoned. And what replaced the fairy tale wasn't peace or justice or fairness, but something far more uncomfortable and far more real. A world where worth couldn't be outsourced to an object or a narrative or a role assigned by default, and the days that followed were messy and loud and uncertain and deeply unpoetic, filled with arguments and false starts and people trying to rebuild the old order in smaller, quieter ways, some successful and some not, but the mirror remained unused, the question unasked. And as I walked away from the palace, not in exile and not in victory, I passed the mirror room without looking inside because I no longer needed to know what it reflected. And behind me the court continued, fragmented and unsure but awake, learning slowly and imperfectly how to live without being measured. And that was the real ending. Not that the queen lost or that I won, but that the question stopped working because I didn't win the fairy tale. I made it unnecessary.